The macabre history of the Eastons. They buried 7 kids alive to keep them safe. Discovery that would shake the foundations of criminal psychology began with a routine soil survey in the remote hills of Montana. Environmental engineer Jake Morrison was conducting ground stability tests on the abandoned Easton property when his equipment detected unusual cavities beneath the Earth's surface. What he initially assumed were natural limestone formations would prove to be something far more sinister, a network of underground chambers that housed one of the most disturbing cases of child abuse ever documented in American history. Easton family had purchased their isolated 300-acre ranch in 1998, seeking what they called purity through separation from a world they believed had become irredeemably corrupt. Robert and Linda Easton were former members of various religious extremist groups who had developed their own apocalyptic theology centered on the belief that the surface world was becoming increasingly poisoned physically, morally, and spiritually. Their solution to protecting their 7 children from this perceived contamination was as methodical as it was horrifying. Over the course of several years, Robert Easton, a former construction contractor, had used his engineering skills to create what he called salvation chambers, reinforced underground bunkers, designed to house each of his children in complete isolation from the outside world. The chambers were marvels of twisted engineering. Each measured approximately 8 feet by 12 feet and was buried 6 feet underground. Constructed with steel-reinforced concrete and equipped with sophisticated life support systems, air filtration units, temperature controls, and waste management systems had been installed to sustain human life indefinitely. Most disturbing of all, each chamber was equipped with a one-way communication system that allowed the parents to speak to their children but prevented the children from responding or communicating with each other. When Morrison's excavation equipment finally broke through the surface of the first chamber, the scene that greeted investigators defied comprehension. Inside the reinforced concrete bunker, they found the skeletal remains of what appeared to be a child, surrounded by years' worth of carefully preserved supplies, canned food, water containers, books, and personal belongings that painted a heartbreaking picture of a life lived entirely underground. The chamber walls were covered with what investigators would later recognize as a calendar system scratched into the concrete with makeshift tools. Thousands of tally marks indicated that the occupant had been tracking days, months, and years with obsessive precision. Alongside the calendar were desperate messages carved into the walls. "When can I come up? I've been good," and most heartbreakingly, "I love you, Mom and Dad." The discovery of the first chamber led to an intensive search of the entire property. Ground-penetrating radar revealed 6 additional underground structures scattered across the ranch, each containing similar scenes of isolation and desperation. 5 of the chambers contained human remains, while 2 showed signs of successful escape attempts, holes clawed through concrete with improvised tools, evidence of the incredible determination required to dig one's way to freedom. Investigation into the family's background revealed the gradual progression of their extremist beliefs. Robert and Linda Easton had started as members of a survivalist community in Idaho, but their paranoia and isolation had gradually separated them, even from fellow extremists. They had come to believe that their children represented the last pure generation of humanity, and that protecting them from contamination was worth any sacrifice. The parents had convinced themselves that their underground system was temporary, protective measure that would preserve their children until the surface world could be cleansed and made safe for pure souls. They had developed an elaborate mythology around their isolation, telling the children that they were sleeping until the earth could be healed, and that their underground chambers were cocoons preparing them for eventual emergence as perfect beings. Communication systems found in each chamber revealed the sophisticated psychological manipulation employed by the parents. Recorded messages played on loop throughout each day, reinforcing the children's isolation while providing what the parents believed was necessary spiritual guidance. The recordings contained a mixture of religious instruction, family stories, and explanations for why the children needed to remain underground for their own safety. The children's ages at the time of their burial ranged from 5 to 15 years old. Each had been told that their confinement was temporary and that they would be released when they had achieved sufficient spiritual purity. The parents had established criteria for graduation from the chambers that were impossible to meet, ensuring that their children would remain buried indefinitely while believing they were working toward eventual freedom. The most disturbing aspect of the chambers was how they had been designed to accommodate long-term human habitation. Each contained educational materials, entertainment devices, and exercise equipment, suggesting that the parents had planned for their children to spend years or even decades underground. The chambers were equipped with monitoring systems that allowed the parents to observe their children's behavior and adjust their psychological conditioning accordingly. Medical examination of the remains found in the chambers revealed the physical toll of underground isolation. The children had suffered from severe vitamin D deficiency, muscle atrophy from lack of proper exercise, and various health problems related to the artificial environment. Most tragic were the signs of self-harm found on several sets of remains, indicating that some children had attempted to injure themselves severely enough to force their parents to bring them to the surface for medical treatment. The investigation revealed that the Easton parents had maintained their underground operation for nearly 15 years, from 1999 to 2014. During this time, they had lived normally on the surface while their children remained buried beneath their feet. They had even received visitors and maintained correspondence with extended family members, none of whom suspected that 7 children were living in artificial graves just yards away. The parents' journals, discovered in the ranch house, documented their daily routines of caring for their buried children. They described delivering food and supplies to each chamber, conducting spiritual education sessions through the communication systems, and monitoring their children's physical and mental condition through surveillance equipment. The journals revealed parents who genuinely believed they were performing acts of love and protection rather than perpetrating systematic abuse. The breakthrough in understanding what had happened to the missing children came when investigators discovered evidence of successful escape attempts. 2 of the chambers showed signs of having been breached from within, with crude tunnels leading toward the surface. The escapees had apparently managed to dig their way out using improvised tools and had fled the property entirely, leaving no trace of their whereabouts. The search for these survivors became a priority for law enforcement agencies across the region. The children would now be adults, possibly living under assumed identities with no official records of their existence. Their survival and escape represented the only hope of understanding the full scope of the Easton family's crimes and the psychological impact of years spent buried alive. As Chapter 1 concluded, investigators were still working to map the full extent of the underground complex and determine the fate of all 7 Easton children. The 2 survivors who had escaped represented a beacon of hope in an otherwise devastating case, but their current whereabouts remained unknown. The question that haunted everyone involved was whether these escapees had managed to integrate into normal society or whether the trauma of their underground imprisonment had left them unable to function in the outside world. The breakthrough in locating the Easton survivors came through an unexpected source, a social worker in Billings, Montana, who had been following the case and recognized similarities to 2 clients she had been working with for several years. Sarah Martinez had been providing counseling services to a pair of siblings who exhibited unusual behaviors and had fragmented memories of childhood trauma that seemed to match the emerging details of the Easton investigation. The siblings, living under the names David and Emma Walsh, had appeared in Billings in 2014 as young adults with no identification. no family connections, and a profound fear of confined spaces that had made it difficult for them to function in normal society. They had been placed in emergency housing and provided with social services, but their inability to provide details about their backgrounds had made it nearly impossible to help them establish normal lives. When contacted by investigators, David and Emma initially resisted discussing their past, exhibiting the extreme wariness that had characterized their interactions with all authority figures. However, the promise of answers about their missing siblings and the opportunity to ensure their parents could never harm other children eventually convinced them to cooperate with the investigation. Their testimony provided the first insider account of life in the underground chambers and revealed the full horror of the Easton family's operation. David, who had been 12 when he was first buried, described the gradual realization that his parents' promises of eventual release were lies. He had spent 7 years in his chamber, listening to the same recorded messages and following the same daily routines, before beginning to suspect that he would never be freed voluntarily. Emma, who had been only 8 when placed underground, provided heartbreaking details about the psychological impact of isolation on developing children. She described talking to imaginary friends, creating elaborate fantasy worlds to escape the reality of her confinement, and developing rituals around the delivery of food that became the only meaningful events in her otherwise empty existence. Siblings' escape had been the result of years of planning and preparation. David had begun using his metal food containers to slowly chip away at the concrete walls of his chamber, working only during times when he knew the surveillance systems were inactive. The process had taken over 2 years, with David hiding his progress behind carefully arranged supplies and personal belongings. Emma's escape had been more spontaneous. When her brother's tunnel finally broke through to the surface in late 2014, he had immediately begun digging toward her chamber. Their reunion underground, after years of isolation, had been both joyful and terrifying as they realized they would need to flee immediately to avoid being returned to their chambers by their parents. The siblings' testimony revealed that their parents had become increasingly unstable in the final years of the operation. Robert Easton had begun showing signs of mental illness, sometimes forgetting to deliver food for days at a time or delivering incoherent rambling messages through the communication systems. Linda Easton had attempted to maintain the routine, but her own psychological state had deteriorated as she struggled to manage 7 isolated children single-handedly. The investigation revealed that the deaths of the 5 children found in the chambers had occurred over several years, primarily due to medical emergencies that the parents had either ignored or been unable to address properly. The Eastons had convinced themselves that their children's deaths were spiritual graduations, rather than the result of their neglect and abuse. David and Emma's descriptions of their siblings painted individual portraits of children who had struggled to maintain their humanity under impossible circumstances. 10-year-old Michael had created an elaborate imaginary school where he taught lessons to invisible students. 13-year-old Rachel had written hundreds of songs and stories, scratching them into her chamber walls when she ran out of paper. 15-year-old Joshua had maintained a complex exercise routine, believing that physical fitness would help him survive until his eventual release. The psychological evaluation of David and Emma revealed the remarkable resilience of children faced with extreme trauma. Despite years of isolation and abuse, both had retained their capacity for empathy, love, and hope. Their ability to plan and execute their escape demonstrated cognitive abilities that had somehow survived years of sensory deprivation and psychological manipulation. The siblings' integration into normal society had been a gradual and ongoing process. They had struggled with basic social interactions, technology, and cultural references that most people took for granted. Simple activities like shopping in crowded stores or sleeping in rooms with windows had triggered panic attacks and flashbacks to their underground imprisonment. However, Their determination to build normal lives had gradually overcome most of these challenges. David had learned to read at an advanced level and had begun taking college courses online. Emma had discovered a talent for art, using her creativity to process her trauma and express emotions she had been forced to suppress. During her captivity, the legal proceedings against Robert and Linda Easton revealed the full extent of their delusional belief system. Both parents continued to insist that they had been protecting their children from a corrupted world and that their actions had been motivated by love rather than cruelty. Their complete inability to recognize the harm they had caused demonstrated the dangerous combination of mental illness and extremist ideology. Robert Easton was diagnosed with severe paranoid schizophrenia and declared incompetent to stand trial. He was committed to a secure psychiatric facility where he continued to express his belief that underground burial was the only way to preserve human purity. Linda Easton was found competent but showed signs of severe psychological dependence on her husband's delusions. The trial became a landmark case in prosecuting unusual forms of child abuse. Linda Easton was convicted on multiple counts of kidnapping, child endangerment, and murder, receiving a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case established important legal precedents for prosecuting parents who harm their children under the guise of protection or religious belief. The discovery of the Easton case prompted significant changes in how authorities monitor isolated families and investigate reports of missing children. New protocols were established for conducting welfare checks on homeschooled children and families living in remote areas. The case also highlighted the need for better mental health resources for individuals with extremist beliefs who might pose dangers to their families. David and Emma Walsh became powerful advocates for survivors of family-based abuse and extremist violence. Their courage in speaking publicly about their experiences helped educate professionals about the long-term effects of isolation and the sophisticated psychological techniques used by abusive parents to maintain control over their children. Siblings worked with psychologists and social workers to develop new treatment approaches for survivors of long-term captivity. Their insights into the mental strategies they had used to survive their imprisonment proved invaluable in helping other victims of similar crimes. The Easton property was eventually purchased by a nonprofit organization and converted into a research center studying the effects of isolation and extremist indoctrination on children. The underground chambers were preserved as evidence and educational tools, helping professionals understand the physical and psychological environments that had shaped the survivors' experiences. A memorial garden was planted above each of the burial sites with native Montana wildflowers chosen to represent the resilience and beauty that can emerge from even the darkest circumstances. The garden serves as a reminder that human cruelty may bury innocence, but it cannot destroy the fundamental human capacity for survival and growth. David and Emma Walsh's transformation from buried victims to articulate advocates demonstrated the remarkable ability of the human spirit to overcome even the most systematic attempts to destroy it. Their story became a powerful testimony to the importance of hope, determination, and the unbreakable bonds between siblings who refuse to let darkness define their future. The Easton case remains one of the most extensively studied examples of familial extremism and child abuse, providing crucial insights for law enforcement, mental health professionals, and child protection services. The courage and resilience of the two survivors continue to inspire others and serve as proof that, even when evil attempts to bury truth and innocence, both have the power to dig their way back to the light. Thank you for watching another tale unfold here on NW Storytime. Every story hides a secret, and tonight you uncovered another one. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us keep the secrets alive. Until next time, stay curious.